Well, hello everybody. First of all, I guess I want to apologize for not being able to join all of you in person. Sometimes it's one of those things where life gets in the way and it just doesn't work out. So I'm recording this to still give a chance to talk about what I think was a really fun topic for me to dive into and something that I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about before getting ready for this presentation. But there were some fundamentals I think I want to revisit and think about. And having grown up on the farm myself, doing a lot of calf chores, remembering how much we fed and the routine of the day and how much starter and when we were feeding starter and all of those things, I realized that the science of feeding calves and what we understand about how they grow and develop has really changed quite a bit. And something that I was glad to revisit and glad to refresh my own knowledge on, and I hope to do the same for all of you. But the name of the presentation is Nutrition Fundamentals, Dairy Calf Nutrition Fundamentals, because I really wanted to stick to some of those core tenets that came out of the literature and I think are implementable now on farm for improved calf performance and growth. So, the first thing we're going to start with here is talking about milk feeding and how much milk to feed and when, different weaning strategies eventually there towards the end. But we'll hit on starters and forage feeding strategies as well, and where those fit and where they don't, because it's not a one size fits all solution, which I'm sure many of you know. But I want to revisit some of the data and some of the reasons for those nuances of this data. And then, like I said, we'll close with weaning strategies and wrap up with some conclusions. So to start with, I think the goal of any calf program, number one is future performance in my mind. We're trying to raise a calf who efficiently and profitably produces milk when she reaches lactation. The other part, and depending on who you ask, this is probably number one or number two, or maybe 1A and 1B, is to raise a calf that's healthy, that reduces or that has less illness, less death, and use that to help save cost and improve animal welfare. So that's probably number 1B for me. And number two, so if we have 1A in performance, 1B in health, number two would be economics. We want to minimize the cost of effectively raising these calves, but I really move that down the list because this is a future investment, and you can't really undo any screw ups or mistakes that we put these calves through when they're young. So much like the postpartum and transition dairy cow, the early calf is a place where I would encourage you to invest time and money to build a really vigorous, resilient animal. Because if we don't, it's all moot later on. We can't rebuild that calf again once she's older. We have one chance to get it right while she's young, and we want to really spend the time and money to get that right. So that's why my goals start with performance and health, and the secondary goal of reaching that performance and health goal in an economic fashion or as economic as possible. So, some of the concepts as we go through this that I want to make sure everybody remembers and thinks about is number one, they are essentially a non-ruminant at birth. They're going to function similar to a monogastric. So, if we think of ourselves or as a pig or something like that, that rumen is not functioning yet and won't be for a couple of weeks. I think the other thing to remember, much like if you've had children, I have a nephew who's growing like a weed right now. They grow fast. Calves are no different. And if we feed them to meet that growth, I think they'll surprise you. So, a non-ruminant growing like gangbusters, and the tissues that are developing within that body, within that animal, are being programmed for later life. We're developing a mammary epithelium starting at birth. We're developing a rumen. We're developing a gut. We're developing the other organs and a liver. So, if we get those programmed properly early on, that animal's set up for health later in life. And finally, the goal is to get energy, protein, and nutrients into the calf, whether it's wet or dry feed. And I think what we have learned is that limiting milk intake early in life was a big mistake for later performance and current growth and later performance. But what it ultimately does come down to is delivering those metabolizable or usable nutrients, whether it's in milk or in starter or in grass hay or something like that. But we'll get to the details. Ultimately, it's getting nutrients into the calf one way or the other. And like I said before, mistakes made during this early life period cannot be fixed later on. So we've got to take the time and energy to get it right now. So as we dive into this, I wanted to revisit colostrum. Super fundamental, super important, and I just think there's no reason not to revisit it constantly. And so what you'll find here is colostrum, I really just stick to dairy calf and heifer gold standards. Collect colostrum at birth, or collect it within 4 hours of birth. Provide that colostrum at 10% of body weight within 2 hours of birth. If you're providing a replacer, target that 150 grams of IgG per dose. And I think it's getting more encouraged to continue with feeding transition milk and colostrum for at least the next 3 to 4 feedings. We've seen that that can help the gut develop, that in some cases has led to improved average daily gain. But I think it's a good practice. Plus, you don't want the transition milk in the bulk tank anyway. You want to have that going where it's most valuable, which is into that calf. So I would encourage you to continue with a colostrum transition feeding for 3 or 4 feedings up to a few days, up to the first few days of life. If you're using a Brix refractometer targeting greater than or equal to 22, 23%, some people are looking at higher than that. Again, I'm just really sticking close to the dairy calf and heifer gold standards, which is down here in this link. Some other notes I think important to remember: pasteurize the colostrum if you can. Helps keep that colostrum clean, and freeze and store it for up to a year. So I, I'm a I I'm a proponent of home colostrum, right? If we can freeze it and feed that later, I prefer that to a replacer. And then a replacer is better than no colostrum. So my order would be fresh, frozen from the farm, or replacer as a last resort. But those are just some other notes to take home with you. And I think the other thing that we may get wrong, especially if you have a mixed herd of Holstein and Jersey or some other breeds, or if you have big calves and small calves or something, is we want to look at this more on a body weight basis than just so many liters per calf. And so the rule or the thought is 10% of body weight as colostrum within 2 hours of birth. So if you have a 45 kilo Holstein calf, we want to give her 4.5 liters within 2 hours of birth. Where if we have a 30 kilo Jersey, 3 liters of colostrum within that 2 hours. Um, so I think that's a good rule of thumb to follow. You know, if you have all Holsteins, shoot for that 4.5 liters and then provide another dose within 24 hours. But again, I just stick close to the dairy calf and heifer gold standard protocols when it comes to colostrum feeding. So don't short them on colostrum. Pay attention and think animal management does have a role in colostrum production. I know there's a couple of ongoing investigations of how we can increase colostrum production at the farm, but I know one tool is rumen protected choline provided prior to calving has demonstrated increased colostrum production in the dams. So that is a tool that if you struggle with colostrum production, perhaps consider providing rumen protected choline to help provide additional colostrum. I think anytime you're implementing a program or really trying to focus on success, you need to have a monitoring strategy in place. So, how should you monitor a colostrum program? Well, ultimately, these are about outputs. We want to know if that calf is getting the IgG she needs, and we want to know if we have healthy calves. So, first of all, I think the main way to monitor your program is to look at the blood and assess the IgG transfer. Collect blood between 2 and 7 days of age, let it clot, and take the serum from that tube and assess the IgG or total protein using using a refractometer, which I have one listed here that a few nutrition companies and calf experts that I really hold in high regard use. And there's an article that goes into more detail from the Vita Plus team on how they tell you to go through the process of collecting blood and monitoring total proteins in calves. Again, here's the goals. And what I think is an important benchmark is you want to have less than 10% of your calves that would fall into that failure range. So if you go into the dairy calf and heifer guideline, there's a table that has different cutoffs for like excellent, good, fair, and failure. We just want to avoid having calves in that failure range and have as many calves as we can in the good to excellent range. So some great benchmarks here. But again, I just wanted to refresh on this colostrum front because I want to spend more time on the post colostrum and up to weaning phase of nutrition. And one of the reasons that calf nutrition has gotten sort of renewed attention in the last probably decade or so is there's an association between average daily gain and first lactation milk yield. And one of the papers to write about that was Soberon et al. 2012. And what they found is that greater pre-weaning average daily gain led to more first lactation milk yield, such that about a tenth of a kilo increase in average daily gain, or 100 grams, resulted in 85 kilograms more milk. So going from zero point 0.8 to zero point 0.9 kilos per day of average daily gain pre-weaning would give you 85 kilograms more milk over that first lactation. And in their analysis, it was a linear response that you can look at over that whole response curve. I would tell you there's a limitation to anything. This is probably more like in reality, if we as we get more data, it's probably more of a flattening line as we get up to this 1.2 and 1.4. There's probably diminishing returns. But if we can get to that zero point 0.8 to 1.2 kilos a day, you're doing pretty well on increasing first lactation milk yield, at least based on the data. So that's why this started getting more attention. So when we start thinking about how do we drive average daily gain, how do we drive calf development, rule number one, water. Calves will consume water in a pretty high clip, especially as they start to consume starters. So it needs to be offered clean and fresh daily. If you can offer room temperature or warm water, generally that's better than cold. There is an energy draw for the calf to warm up the cold water once it gets into the rumen, but these are what I would call 1% improvements. This is how you get to that top tier of calf health, but offer clean, fresh water every day. This is something growing up that we did not do. And looking at the data now, it's quite clear that it's helpful. Um, it's important to remember that as starter intake increases, you need to continue offering more water, even to the point where if you're feeding calves, say twice a day, where you go in the mornings to do milk and starter and go in the afternoons to do milk and starter, make sure you're offering water with each of those meals. But if they're eating enough starter, you may need to go back and offer a third helping of water, perhaps in the middle of the day, to make sure they're hydrated. So again, as starter intake increases, offer more water. Generally, it's a 4-to-1 ratio of water to starter intake. So that's kind of a good number to keep in mind. The other thing that was interesting is there was a research project done where they offered starter and water next to each other or distinctly separate within the hutch. And it's important, they actually saw improved performance when the starter and the water were offered in separate locations. And I think the main part of that being we reduced the contamination of that water getting into the starter and kind of clogging it up and growing mold and a bunch of nonsense you don't want in a calf starter anyway. So I think if you are offering shouldn't be if you're offering. When you offer water, offer it in a distinctly separate location from the dry feed if you're feeding in a single hutch. That's something that can really help maintain feed hygiene, and it has shown evidence of improving calf performance. Okay, so with that, we'll jump into the milk feeding regimen. And this is going to be the bread and butter of calf nutrition. And I think to start with, at least when I was reading and studying this topic a bit more, was I think we need to understand how much would a calf drink if we just let them drink? Like we just put a big old milk tank in front of them and let them drink until they were plumb full. Um, the data from the previous research and published in NASEM, which is kind of our dairy cow nutrition textbook, suggested that calves will drink about 2.25 of their body weight on a dry matter basis, 2.25% on a dry matter basis of milk if we would let them. There's a range to that. It could go all the way up to 3% in some cases, but 2.25 is kind of a good rule. So if we think of a newborn Holstein calf at 45 kilos a day, that would put her dry matter intake of milk at 1.01 kilos, which equates to about 8 liters of milk, 8 liters a day. If we look at a Jersey, that would equate to about 5.5 liters a day. So in my mind, if we're feeding that calf, we want her to drink all she can, especially those early stages where she's still developing an immune system. She's just beginning to grow. She's adjusting to a new environment. I want her to get all the nutrients she can, and she's not going to eat dry feed much yet. So milk is where it's at. So I don't want to short that. So this is really where I started with thinking about how much milk to offer and when. So if you have Holstein calves, I think you need to be offering 7 to 8 liters. If you have Jerseys, 5 to 6. And right out of the gate, because that's how they're going to consume most of their nutrients. So but that's the starting point. That's how much calves would drink if we just let them drink. Now, with that in mind, how much will they grow? So this is based on a Holstein calf, a 45 kilo calf at 1 week of age, targeting that zero point 0.8 average daily gain in a neutral temperature. So you've got to remember if the temperature is falling outside of some range, calves are going to have to compensate for that. They'll grow a little bit less because energy is going elsewhere. But if they are meeting, or if we're feeding them that ad libitum milk, we will generally meet that zero point 0.8 kilograms per day target. Given that current production levels, milk fat is pretty high, our energy was pretty high, our protein might be a little short in a milk-only diet or in a high-fat whole milk situation. But nonetheless, that ad libitum milk consumption around 7.5 liters per day for a Holstein initially will meet those growth targets. So I think that makes sense for starting that calf out at a 7 or 8 liter a day. If it's a Holstein, 5.5 or 6. If it's a Jersey, will help meet those growth targets. Well, then it's okay if they're going to meet those growth targets with milk. Why do we even feed dry feed? And I wanted to revisit this fundamental question because I think it's good to keep these things in mind. So they will grow really well and efficiently on a milk-only diet. There's no question of that. Those calves will gobble up as much milk as you give them, and as they get bigger, they'll drink more and they will keep growing. There's no question. Um, and the interesting part is the energy from milk is more efficiently used for tissue energy. About 55% of the energy from milk is converted to retain tissue, while only 40% from starter. So it's like, oh, well, if the energy from milk is more efficient, we should feed more of that, less starter. But why do we feed dry feed eventually? Well, ultimately, it's because it's not just about growing a calf, it's about developing a rumen. And we know from classic images from Penn State that in a milk-only diet, this is what your rumen looks like. It's got a smooth surface, there's no papillae, low absorptive area, limited epithelial growth, just not something we want. But if we provide a calf starter, um, that avoids ruminal acidosis, but we provide a texturized starter, we start to see excellent papillae development, a bunch of absorptive area, the vascularization and growth of that rumen really drives later development and later growth once these calves are weaned. So although calves grow really well on a high milk diet, we do still need to develop a rumen, which is why that dry feed becomes so critical. One of the other questions I was interested to kind of just go back to and revisit is, should I feed milk replacer or whole milk? What's the deal? What's good? What's bad? This goes back to one of those fundamental concepts that I started the presentation with, which is ultimately it's about getting nutrients into the calf, period, end of story. However you do that is just fine. So if we look at Holstein whole milk, that's going to be 5.4 megacals per kilogram of energy. And that's pretty high energy. But why is that? It's because milk fat has continued to climb. So if you're a Holstein producer, you're probably making milk at a 4 to a 4.3 milk fat. That's a lot of energy for that calf. So whole milk from a Holstein or whole milk from a Jersey, high energy feed, good amount of protein, and the sugars that are there are also contributing a little bit of energy as well. But if we look at milk replacers, what we would have fed growing up, a classic 2020 blend has 4.7 megacals per kilogram of feed. So less energy, less protein. You would need to feed more of it to reach the same growth benchmarks. And if we look at, I think, a more modern milk replacer, something if you're going to feed a replacer, I would suggest a blend like this. That's a high protein, low fat blend, a 2617. We'll get a little lower energy, but that protein is really, really important in this case, and I'll show you why. But the main point here is if you're feeding a replacer or feeding whole milk, you need to feed the amount that meets those energy requirements and work with a nutritionist to make sure that that program is meeting your growth requirements and setting those calves up for success. So if I was feeding whole milk, I would need a little less milk to meet that same energy requirement than if I was feeding milk replacer. So just some things to consider. So what does it look like? What would our models and math estimate if we were feeding these three options? So if we were feeding a 45 kilo calf at a 1 week old for 0.8 kilograms per day of target average daily gain, here is the first scenario, which is the estimated average daily gain at that ad libitum intake of 1.01 kilograms of dry matter. Feeding whole milk replacer on an energy basis is the greatest. Why? Because there's more energy in milk replacer. But then on a protein basis, the 2617 milk replacer seems to do best. What I want to drive home here is that a classic 2020 replacer does not meet the needs of a calf trying to grow at a 0.8 kilograms per day. So at an equal intake, whole milk and the high protein starter probably are superior, or high protein replacer. But if we come over here and we look at the kilograms of dry matter needed to meet the energy and protein requirements of that calf growing at this 0.8 kilograms per day rate, you'll see that if you're feeding a 2020 replacer, this red column, you need more of it to meet those requirements compared to feeding a whole milk for just a whole milk or a high protein replacer. So I think this is really important to keep in mind. So if you've got to be strategic, just like we would with a lactating herd ration or a dairy cow ration, calves, it's much the same. We need to make sure we're providing the nutrients to meet those requirements. So in this case, if you're feeding whole milk, you need less of it. If you're feeding a high protein replacer, you need a little less of it to meet the protein needs, but the energy needs still are going to be a bit of a challenge. And then a 2020 replacer, you need a lot of it to hit that protein that that calf needs to grow. When you're looking at replacers and milk products, I wanted to just touch on that quality counts as well. You should consider what ingredients go into that milk replacer. Is it a dairy-based protein? Most high-quality calf replacers are really going to be based on a dairy protein, so I'm not too worried about it. But if you're trying to go on the cheap and have been shorting your calves, you might want to look into what sources of fat and protein are in that calf replacer. Are the fats from tallow and grease, or are they from dairy fats or palmitic acid or something like that? Not only that, the protein sources that contribute to that replacer need to be considered. Again, most of these are going to be a dairy-based protein, which is excellent, which is what I would tell you or encourage you to purchase. But if you're buying something that's on the cheap side of things, it might have other protein sources that could be heat damage, could have reduced amino acid availability. So it's just something to really pay attention to. So if you're looking at a milk replacer, I think you want to make sure they have some research data or quality data to back that up. You want to make sure that the calf digests it well, that the calf grows on it well. Um, and it's a good habit to get into is when you're purchasing these products, look at what the data say and see if it fits for your operation and your goals. In general, this is why I try to encourage whole milk because it's easy. The calf is made to consume it. We've got it right there at the farm. If you have a batch pasteurizer, you can pasteurize it as well, which is a great practice. But nonetheless, if you're doing a replacer, you want a high quality replacer with high quality, generally dairy based ingredients. And if you can, excuse me, um, if you can't do that, then you want to make sure you still have a high quality replacer that meets those nutrient requirements of the calf. And again, I would say a 26 protein, 17 fat replacer seems to be kind of a standard now with higher quality milk replacers. So we've talked about kind of how much calves will drink if we just let them. We've talked about whole milk versus replacers, the quality of those replacers. And so how much milk should we feed them? This has become a really hot topic, and I had a lot of enjoyment reading the literature. And even in the NASEM textbook, the amount of milk or milk replacer to feed remains controversial. It's something that's not necessarily settled in the eyes of the calf expert community. But what has been demonstrated more and more in the last few years is that, the limit milk feeding protocols of, say, 4 to 6 liters a day stunted organ development and tissue development. What we've demonstrated in a couple of examples is that greater milk allotment early on in life leads to greater mammary development, and it also reduces natural behaviors and hunger, or reduces hunger behaviors and encourages positive natural behaviors, which is also great for calf welfare. But what you'll see here is an example. Here they had a moderate milk feeding program and a high milk feeding program. And what you have on this chart is the parenchyma weight at 8 weeks and the parenchyma weight at 14 weeks. And you can see in that high milk feeding group, in both cases, we had more parenchyma or more mammary tissue made and laid down in that high milk feeding group. So pushing more milk into these calves than we've traditionally done generates or generally helps develop that mammary tissue, which is excellent for later milk production. So again, I think that's something to really consider is we're not just growing calves, we're growing organs, and milk delivery seems to develop a really good mammary organ in that young calf. Also, obviously, a consideration here is more milk does mean less starter intake, and I will get into that about how to balance it because it does. But again, remember, it does come down to nutrients into that calf. That's the goal, getting her required nutrients into that calf. So, if we start thinking about dry feed, we need to think about when do we offer it? When do they start consuming it? What does it look like? So this is data from Kraus. We weigh the feed that these calves get fed every day, and I know the staff sometimes wonders why we do it, but it's to make sure that we're meeting our benchmarks. But anyway, what I wanted to demonstrate here is that our calves are not necessarily on a high milk diet. They're getting 6 liters a day for the Holsteins, and I think 5 for the Jerseys, something like that. But for the Holsteins, you'll see 6 liters a day is not a ton of milk based on what I've shown you. That 7 to 8 liters is probably some area for us to push forward in. But in this case, on even a lower milk diet, they're not consuming much starter until about 2 weeks of age. They're consuming maybe about a quarter of a pound by 2 weeks of age. Then it really starts to take off, and it really takes off here around 5 weeks of age. So the point of showing this is that in this early phase of life, we cannot rely on starter to meet the nutrient and growth requirements, which is why I'm a proponent of a little bit more milk for a Holstein, something in that 7 to 8 liters, even up to 9 or 10 in some cases that some people are doing. I don't advocate for that. I'm looking more on that 7 to 8. But this is why higher milk feeding is so important, is those calves just don't eat much early on, and we need to rely on milk to meet their requirements. So again, use milk to meet those early nutrient requirements. 6 to 7.5 liters per day for a 45 kilo calf will meet this range of targeted growth. So just keep that in mind. Um, a question that I think comes up is, can calves handle that much milk early, or does it lead to health issues? Do you lead to diarrhea and scours? I think that was a reason that there was so much concern around feeding additional milk. And I think the important thing to remember is scours and diarrhea is different than just a high milk diet, soft stool. Like those two things are different. The calf looks different. So I think you've got to start monitoring calf health in a different way if you're just looking at manure. If you have a calf who might have a loose stool, but her ears are up, her eyes are bright, she's bouncing around, she's probably in pretty good spirits, even if her stool's a little runny, especially if she's drinking a high milk diet. Obviously, if you have a calf whose ears are down, eyes are droopy, maybe a little runny, and the nose is a little wet, um, or runny with mucus, she's probably a sick calf. So I think we need to pay attention more to behavior and less to some of those other outputs. But what this study did was looked at, should we increase the allotment over time to let that calf adjust, or should we just start them at an 8 liter per day allotment? And they had two treatments, starting calves at 8 liters a day or slowly increasing them from 4 up to 8. And what they saw, and which, based on energy and growth requirements, I would expect, is the calves that got more nutrients early in life from milk grew by zero point 0.1 kilos a day more. Health status in each group was similar. So again, I don't think you necessarily need to worry about ramping up these calves, but I do think for Holsteins, we need to be feeding 7 to 8 liters a day early in life because they're not going to be consuming starter to meet their energy requirements. And this study demonstrates that quite nicely. So we'll pivot from milk feeding recommendations. So kind of a wrap up on that. The classic programs of limiting milk to 4 to 6 liters a day, I don't think is optimum from it is not optimum for growth. It is not optimum for calf health. We need to be delivering a bit more milk to these calves. I would encourage you, if you're feeding Holsteins, to be in the 7 to 8 liter a day range. If you're feeding Jerseys, 5.5. Um, but it's all about meeting that calf's growth requirements, meeting those nutrient requirements. And early in life, they are not eating enough dry feed to do that. We need to deliver it through milk. So, starter. How do we fit starter into the picture? So, first of all, what do we know about calf starters? Like I said earlier, it's critical for the development of the rumen. So, it's important for that shift from a pre-ruminant to a ruminant. It's because of the VFA production that that starter can generate once it's in the rumen that helps drive that tissue development. The research does suggest, it does demonstrate, you want to offer starter during that first week of life, and you want to offer it and keep it fresh until they start consuming. And the reason for that is you will have calves that will eat pretty aggressively right away. There are always some just heavy eaters. But then there are calves that will just nose it around for a couple days. They'll start smelling it, they'll start thinking about it, and maybe nibble a little bit here and then. But then they're familiar with it, they know what it is. And then as you introduce more or as they get more hungry, they'll be comfortable and start eating pretty regularly. Uh, you really need at least 3 weeks of consistent starter intake to promote rumen development. And there is some data that you want 3 consecutive days of so many pounds of starter intake. And we'll get to some of those numbers. But you really want 3 weeks of sustained aggressive rumen calf starter intake. And like I said before, we want to separate the starter from any liquid feeds to reduce those contaminations because that helps improve starter intake and improve average daily gain. I'm going to revisit these images again because I think it's super important. Milk only, no papillae. Milk with some hay, still no papillae. Milk with a texturized starter, bunch of papillae, vascularization, and a developed rumen. So this middle image is really what we're going for. We want a calf that has a rumen that is ready to rock once she is weaned, and starters help accomplish that goal. One of the main conversations around calf starters is the form of that calf starter. Do we want to feed a meal? Do we want to feed a pellet? Or do we want to feed a texturized starter? So, meal and pellet, exactly what you'd think. Meal is a ground feed, pelleted is pushed through a pellet mill, and texturized is going to have a portion of that grain in a, in its whole form or in a non-ground form. You can see we have chunks of flaked corn or barley and wheat or oats. and some other pellets in there. So that's kind of what we mean by texturized, is it's going to have those whole grains that the calf can then ruminate on and chew on. But the data has shown those texturized starters can be really, really beneficial. So what's the best form of starter? I think in general, if I was going to give you one answer with no nuance, I would say feed a texturized starter. Straight and simple, texturized starter. What is texturized? As I said before, 45% of that starter needs to come from whole grains that are not ground. So think whole, rolled, and flaked corn. In general, the benchmark being 80% of those particles are going to be greater than 1.1 millimeters, and the mean particle size of the whole mix is about 2 millimeters. So there is a group that tried to look into calf performance on different starters, and I want to give them credit for trying to go through a really noisy data set. But they looked at a whole bunch of comparisons, and there's two comparisons relevant for this conversation that I pulled out of there. And it's textured starter with hay versus ground starter with hay. And the reason I think this is an interesting comparison is both of them had hay in the mix, but here textured starter led to a greater feed intake for those calves. And then if we look at textured starter versus pelleted starter, again, textured led to greater feed intake in those calves, which should equate to greater energy intake and greater average daily gain. So in this case, or in these cases, I think it's well demonstrated that textured starters are preferred. But big caveat from that paper. And I think these two authors did a nice job of being well reasoned in their evidence, but they said there was not sufficient evidence for recommendation of starter physical form for improving growth rates. So although the feed intake did change, growth rates were fairly similar. But I think from a grand scheme of things, we want calves eating, we want them eating aggressively. So driving feed intake is important, which is why I would encourage a texturized starter. The other considerations to remember, though, is if you are feeding a ground or a pelleted starter, you should offer a little bit of grass hay, just a little bit of dry hay, especially if they're not on a wheat straw bedding. But when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit, less than 5% of their dry matter intake. We're talking maybe a tenth of a kilo, 100 grams. That's like a handful of dry hay, a pinch. It's not much that those calves need. But in those pelleted starters and meal starters, you can have some acidosis issues, and the grass hay can help buffer that. It gives the calves something to chew on and begin that rumination process. Also, we want to reduce the fines in any calf starter, especially think about a pelleted starter. We want a really hard pellet with low fines. And the reason for that is if you get more fines, you can reduce intake, causing acidosis in those calves, and you can end up reducing gain because of it. So, number one, I'd say consider a texturized starter first. If you are feeding a meal or a pellet, you should offer a little bit of grass hay, but not much. And if you are feeding meal or especially a pellet, you want to reduce those fines because that can reduce performance. So, what should that starter generally look like? What are some considerations we ought to have in mind? There's a lot of combinations that work. And again, I'm going to go back to the idea that it's all about meeting your calf's nutrient requirements. So, your starters should be balanced or thought of in complement to the milk that you're feeding. But in general, crude protein should be 20 to 26%, starch 22 to 38. This is a big range. And again, it's not so much about the nutrient, it's about the energy that that starch provides. We have started to see that higher sugar can be beneficial for these calves, but you don't want to just dump a bunch of molasses in there. And once you get over 7% dry matter of that starter as molasses, you start to lose intake and lose performance. So that starch sugar blend, there's a little bit of range to play in there, but if you fall within these ratio or within these ranges, you're in the ballpark. Um, NDF 13% and then fat 3 to 4%. I think the big thing with calves though is supplemental fat in the starter has reduced starter intake, so you don't need a high fat starter. The fat that's included in those grains, whether it's corn, wheat, barley, oats, whatever's in there, is probably sufficient and no need to add any more based on the data we have now. But these ranges for the nutrient specs will keep you in the ballpark, should grow up a pretty healthy calf. In general, I would encourage a little higher protein towards the higher end of that spectrum to really drive on these high growth programs. And the protein bit is interesting because there was some research done, and I loved this paper when I found it in the literature, is that when feeding higher amounts of milk, which I'm kind of advocating here, that 8 liters a day number is sort of the number I have in mind, and you'll see that in my very end recommendations, is a high protein starter becomes a bit more necessary. Well, why is that? They're getting a bunch of protein from milk. Why do I need more protein in the starter? Well, if you're providing a higher plane of milk, They're going to eat a little less starter, especially initially. So you want that starter to be more nutrient dense. And what they saw is when we provide a high protein starter, so compare the red bar to the gray bar. This is the high milk, low crude protein starter, and this is the high milk, high crude protein starter. Is that our rumen, so the average daily gain between those groups fairly similar at 5 and 10 weeks. But what I love to see is they looked at rumen development. And the rumen development was substantially greater on that high crude protein starter, on a 22% as fed, 25% dry matter starter as crude protein. So that's a big dramatic increase in rumen weight. So again, I think this high crude protein starter, when we're feeding a high milk diet, really helps develop that rumen, especially based on this data. So if you're sticking with my plan of feeding that 8 liters a day, you want to drive a high crude protein starter into that calf to keep that rumen developing. Then the question is how much starter? Again, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but you want to offer that starter within the first week of life. Let that calf get familiar with that starter, let her get familiar with what it is, and if we have a Holstein or a large breed, I want them consuming 3 pounds of starter per day for at least 3 consecutive days prior to weaning. So we want to set up our feeding program to get them to that intake level before we wean them off. Jerseys and small breeds, 2.5 pounds for that same 3 consecutive days. So we'll get to what I think a good feeding program will look like. But what I want to say is if you're setting up a feeding program for your farm, is it a little bit of trial and error. Figure out how much milk you want to feed and start there, and then tinker. How much and when, how much starter, when do you want to start offering starter, what starter seems to work best for you, or do you want to switch from whole milk to milk replacer, then how should you adjust to optimize your program? It's going to be a little trial and error, but if you're paying really close attention, it'll be well worth the investment. But like I said, a 100-gram increase in dry matter intake from milk will increase starter by about 60 grams based on the data. So that's the balance we're walking here. We want to get calories into that calf using milk, but we know that there's a sacrifice with starter intake. So on starters, texturized, generally better. We want to offer it within the first week of life, and we want that calf to be eating 3 pounds of starter a day for 3 consecutive days before we start weaning them on milk. So, what about forage? To feed or not to feed is a great question. So, when should I feed forage? You should feed it if you're feeding a ground or pelleted starter and have no straw bedding for that calf. Again, very small amount, less than 5% dry matter of their whole dry matter intake. When is it not necessary? Well, if you're feeding a texturized starter with that 45% whole grains, there's no evidence that you need forage in there to grow that calf, especially if you're feeding a texturized starter and they're on a bedded straw. You don't need forage in the diet. But again, if you feed it in any sense of the word, less than or equal to 5% of diet dry matter. So if we think about forage in the context of our goals of pre-weaning calf nutrition, we want to grow the calf well. And forage for a pre-ruminant, for a calf that doesn't have a functioning rumen, forage is just bulk. It's low energy. It's not going to provide her much because those bugs in the rumen aren't working well yet, and it may reduce energy intake. And forages, because they're poorly digested compared to concentrates, don't aid in rumen development, which those Penn State images show. But calf starters that are well fermented do. So feeding forages simply, in my opinion, don't fit into the goals of an effective calf feeding program. So if we're looking at hay provisions for a calf, think, all right, this calf is eating about 2.5 pounds of starter. The max hay intake we said was 0.05 or 5%. Those are the same thing. This is a decimal basis. That's a tenth of a pound of hay. A tenth of a pound. Not much. There's not much there. That is the maximum amount you should be providing. And this, again, is only if you're feeding a meal or a pelleted starter. If you're feeding a texturized starter, there's no evidence that the grass hay is helpful in growing those calves. Some might say, well, I was feeding hay and my average daily gains were higher. Sometimes that can be true, but it's not because that animal is growing better. It's just because she has more gut fill and more bulk in her gut. That doesn't help you. You want to grow the tissue. You want to grow the calf. You don't want to fill the gut with just a bunch of forage. So again, when I look at these data, there's just no evidence that forage is all that helpful unless you're feeding a meal or a pelleted starter. So texturized starters, don't worry about the forage. If you're feeding on wheat straw, again, you probably don't need to worry about the forages so much. So we've got the feeding thoughts in place. What about weaning programs? What should we do? Um, Big one, number one, and should be done is wean in steps, not abruptly. The data demonstrates that welfare and growth are improved when we wean in steps. So in general, This abrupt strategy going from their full milk intake to zero, bad idea. Just don't do it. The two strategies I would tell you to consider is to drop in two steps, say go from 2 a day feeding to 1 a day feeding to zero. So maybe in 1 week increments. Some have shown that even better is to go, by 25% increments or maybe by a third. So if you're feeding twice a day at 8 liters, go from 8 liters to six in two feedings of 3 liters. Then go from six to four and four to zero or something like that. Just give that calf time to adjust. Plus, during this time, when you start cutting milk back a little bit, their starter intake will really begin to take off because they are going to be hungry. They're adjusting to that new diet, and then you'll really start to get more starter intake during this time. So why do we care? Does it actually affect performance? Step down weaning increases starter intake and reduces the post-weaning slump. So here you can see in the abrupt weaning phase, or if we do an abrupt weaning phase, that average daily gain during that weaning phase is negative. Those cows lose weight during that stage. Their starter intake, it's okay. If we phase them out over 4 days, our starter intake is much better. Our average daily gain is still positive. But if we stretch it out even farther for 10 days, in this case, better starter intake, better average daily gain. And they did a 22-day weaning, which it was a bit odd because they didn't move. The weaning age was the same, so they just kept moving the step back further earlier in life. So this study is a bit odd, but it clearly demonstrates the positive effects of a slow weaning program. So, with all that in mind, what would I suggest? I think something that I want to leave you with is what I think is a solid program. And so, for me, I would suggest feeding a pasteurized whole milk or a high protein milk replacer with a texturized calf starter that's 22% protein as fed or 25 to 26 protein on a dry matter basis. You want to feed colostrum for that first day, and then 7 liters a day for the first 2 weeks. And then as that calf grows, her nutrient requirements will also grow. So then we'll bump her to 8 liters a day for this week 3 through week 6. Then I start stepping her down slowly. And you'll see I stretch it over 3 weeks and I'm feeding these calves milk for a little bit longer. Then by week 9, I want them consuming that 3.5 to 4 pounds a starter. Week 10, they're completely weaned. So again, I'm not saying this is a cheap program, but I'm saying this program I think is a great starting point and will grow calves really well. And this is all based on Holstein calves. For Jerseys, you would scale some of these numbers back, but I think the principle holds. The other thing I have highlighted here in yellow is this is when I want to test the blood between 2 and you could go up to 7 days, but I want to be in that 2 to 5 day range to look at total proteins and passive transfer. So, in my opinion, this is a good place to start. And that is my opinion based on a read of the literature. So, welcome to take critiques or thoughts on that, but that's kind of a good starting point, I would suggest. The main takeaway being we need to feed more milk, probably up to that 8 liters. Some farms are going up to 10 or 12, and in robot settings where they can dial it up or back on a pretty immediate basis, they're getting pretty nuanced. But if this is based on a feeding in a hutch twice a day, and I think this is a good program that will still allow you to be time efficient, but also grow a really healthy calf. So, what are some growth benchmarks we need to consider? Again, this is straight out of dairy calf and heifer. I'm not going to put a bunch of time into walking through thinking about these things in a different aspect, but the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association's done a great job looking at these benchmarks. So for Holstein, we're looking at, a small Holstein would be 1,400 pounds, a big one would be this 1,800. At birth, they're going to be 80 to 90 pounds. By weaning, I want them to have doubled that body weight. By first breeding, they need to be 55% of that total. So if we're not meeting this benchmark, we're going to lose fertility and lose performance. And at first calf, they need to be 85% of their mature body weight. If they are not, they will have reduced performance in those next two lactations. So we need to grow calves well and efficiently. So with that in mind, what is the approximate average daily gain targets in that birth to weaning phase? For large calves, in the large breed, the 1,400, 1,800 pound mature weight, they would say 1.4 to 1.6 pounds. This is one place where dairy calf and heifer is probably a little bit light on their recommendations. There are many farms hitting 1.8 to 2.2 pounds a day. I'd even heard of a farm that if that calf doesn't hit 2 pounds a day, average daily gain, they sell it because they have enough heifers. They don't need them, but they only want the ones that grew really, really well. So that's what's going on out there. So I think this number's a little light. I'd be shooting more for that 1.8 to 2 pounds a day average daily gain prior to weaning. What about health benchmarks? What are some health benchmarks to keep in mind? And again, these benchmarks only do you good if you're monitoring. So you need to monitor your calf health and maintain calf disease records just as you would for lactating cows. But for pneumonia in that pre-weaning stage, less than 10%. For scours in that pre-weaning phase, less than 15%. Your survival rate on those calves in that weaning phase should be 97 to 98%. And I think that is very, very simple to accomplish with a hygienic housing environment and a hygienic, effective feeding protocol. This needs to be the standard. I did want to put a few notes in here on group housing and robot systems. And what I was really interested in is there are some very consistent responses to pair housing, group housing. And one of the main ones is earlier and greater starter intake. So there's a few studies I have shown here on the right. Now we're at all 21 compared single or pairs. The pairs ate more or gain more on average daily gain by a substantial margin. Miller, Cushion, and DeVries in 2016. Greater starter intake, similar average daily gain. Costa et al. 2015. Greater average daily gain, greater starter intake. So pair housing, I was initially a bit skeptical, but if you're doing everything right, keeping those hutches clean, keeping those calves clean, if you have age groups that are close enough in age where you can put calves together where you don't have one that's way bigger than the other, pair housing seems to be effective. And it's effective because it seems to improve starter intake and it seems to get calves eating starter earlier. And I think there is a learned behavior aspect of that. So I don't want to put away, or we shouldn't minimize the behavioral science aspect, but those calves that are housed together probably seem to learn from each other and eat a little bit more. I do want to add to that, there was a recent study looking at season, which I have pulled up here, where they did pair housing in the summer and pair housing in the winter. And pair housing seemed especially helpful in the winter. So you'll see here in the summer on the left, starter intake 0.14 and 0.17 for single and pair housing. Average daily gain, fairly similar. But what you'll see is in the winter, we start to see some separation. Starter intake was much greater for pairs in the winter than singles in the winter. And average daily gain was significantly increased in the pairs for the winter compared to singles. So I really want to encourage you to consider pair housing and think about what it could look like because it does seem to get that starter intake higher. And I want to go back a minute because what I want to point out is that this approach, the group housing approach or pair housing approach, seems to work well with higher milk feeding um, programs. And that is critical because it will reduce those hunger behaviors. It will reduce it may reduce cross suckling. One of the big things that helps reduce cross suckling in these systems is a slow feeding nipple. It's not so much feeding more milk, but it's about slowing down how quickly those calves eat the milk or drink the milk, pardon me. That reduces cross suckling. Again, if you're doing this, strict sanitation is necessary to keep those calves healthy. Other monitoring, so when you're monitoring your program, what should you be paying attention to? Like I said, here at Kraus Dairy at the university, we monitor starter intake every day. I encourage everybody to do that. We want to make sure those calves are eating that 3 to 3.5 pounds of starter prior to weaning. The only way to know that is to track intake. Daily milk intake. In the very least, I want to know if she refused milk. A healthy calf should rarely, if ever, refuse milk. So, in the program I outlined, feeding 8 liters a day, I would just simply have a checklist of, all right, go through with a little scale, how much feed was left over from the day before, write that down, calculate her feed intake on starter. Then I just want to check box. Did she drink all of her milk? Yes or no? Yes if she did, no if she didn't. You want to keep track of that because I think the milk refusal is an early sign of stress or health problems. And then if we want to look at gains, we got to monitor birth weights. So I think it's great to monitor birth weights. As soon as that calf hits the ground and mom's had some time to lick her off, put her on a scale, see what she weighs. And then when you wean those calves off of milk, or if you're just wanting like an 8 week weight or something, check those as well. Check them in groups, maybe once or twice a week to make sure you're meeting those goals. This is a case where you don't need to check all of your weaning weights or every calf, although I think that's great. Maybe a sampling of 5 or 10 a week or something just to make sure you're still meeting that average daily gain target you've set for yourself. So my bottom line, milk, greater milk allotment increases early growth and early mammary development. 6 liters a day should be considered a minimum, and I wouldn't consider that an optimum. I think greater than or equal to 8 liters a day, which is where I'm living now with my calf programs. Starter should be texturized, in my opinion, and it complements the milk to meet their nutrient requirements. Calves should be consuming 3 pounds a day for at least 3 days prior to weaning. And then growth. More early growth equals more first lactation milk yield. So I think you want to be targeting that 1.7 to 2 pounds a day of gain, as I mentioned earlier. So, like always, please follow our extension team. We're trying to crank out a lot of work and serve you guys as well as we can. And please reach out if you have any questions. Again, I am so sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person. I was really excited to give this seminar in person and talk to you guys about calf nutrition. But if there's questions that came up during my presentation, just shoot me an email. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and I can share some of the resources that I used to build this PowerPoint. So again, thank you. Feel free to reach out and have a great day.